friends on Facebook and YouTube, and I'm so glad you're all here. So we are learning books of Ketuvim, books of the third section of the Hebrew Bible. But before we get started, Brother Douglas has asked a question. So now that we're online and the whole world is watching, Douglas, ask again.
My question has to do with food. Next week, Pesach is a week from Saturday night.
My God.
Therefore, we have to go shopping.
Yes, we do.
Kitniyot, is it good? Is it not?
Kitniyot.
What's the status of corn as kitniyot?
You ask a fine question, my son. A fine question. So let's quickly do a moment on the food science behind Passover. Okay. So Pesach, according to the Torah, you are supposed to avoid all leavened grains. Okay. And all leavened grains, according to the Torah, are 7 of them, and I can name 4. So it's wheat, barley, oats, millet. I forgot what the other ones are. Smelt, yeah, whatever those. Spelt, not smelt. Smelt is a fish. Spelt. And then, of course, the question is, how is spelt, right? So here are 2 problems. You raised 2 wonderful problems, okay? So you're not supposed to eat leavened grain. What is a grain? A grain is a vegetable that grows as a grass and has a very high starch content, a sugar content, so that when you combine it with water, it releases the sugars. And the reason why grains leaven themselves is because there's yeast in the air, and the yeast in the air feasts upon the yeast in the air feasts upon the sugars in the grain that are released when a grain gets wet, and when they feast upon those sugars, they reproduce. And when a yeast cell reproduces, it releases carbon dioxide and alcohol. Okay, so carbon dioxide and alcohol is what gives you the fizz and the buzz of the beer, right? It also what gives you rising grain, rising breads. Okay, so far so good. Okay, that's the rule. So the rule is you're not allowed to eat those 7 grains because they are liable to have gotten wet somewhere in the process from harvest to consumption. Okay, the reason why you can have matzah is because matzah has been watched from the time it was harvested to the time it was baked. And the only time it became wet was for the few minutes between the time it was kneaded and the time it was thrown into a very, very hot oven, which kills all the yeast cells. So matzah is acceptable, but any other grain, even the stuff that matzah would be made out of, is not acceptable because if it had gotten wet, it released the sugars attracted the yeast cells reproduced, and there's latent carbon dioxide bubbles in it. So far, so good. Everybody listening so far? Got it? Now, there is a second principle in Jewish law, which applies not just to Passover, to all Jewish law, called the Principle of Siag. And the Principle of Siag simply says that not only do you have a prohibition, when you have a prohibition, we set the line of prohibition far back from the edge of the prohibition, so there's no chance that you will get in trouble. Let me explain it very vividly. When I lived in New York in the late 1970s and early 1980s, New York welcomed lots and lots of tourists from Japan. And they would habitually fall into the subway tracks and get run over by subway cars. And there were these gruesome headlines in the New York Post in the morning and the Daily News about Mr. and Mrs. whoever from Yokohama or Nagasaki or Tokyo who got run over by the E train or the D train or the number 2 train. So the genius is that the New York Metropolitan Transit Authority painted a bright yellow line across the edge of the platform and put up giant signs in English, French, Spanish, and Japanese saying, "For your own safety, stay well behind the line." It didn't help. It didn't help. Now, any genius could tell you why it didn't help. It didn't help because the line was right at the edge of the platform, and by the time you get that close, you're going to fall in anyway. Everyone was sort of leaning over to see if the train was coming. That's how people got into trouble. It took them a year, the geniuses, the New York Metropolitan Transit Authority, to figure out the solution to said problem. You paint the line where? Yes, 3 feet back. If the line is 3 feet back from the edge of the platform and now you don't cross the line, well, now you have a better chance of surviving, right? Hang on just a second. Lunch and learn on the 24th, but not on the 31st. At what time? 8 p.m. And yes, no 24th. Anyway, I'm answering questions from 6 different people. So, wait a minute. 24. Yes on the 24th. Yes. Yes on 24. No. Anyway, so that's called the principle of Siag. Okay. So far, so good. Everybody listening? So now I'm not allowed to have grains because grains become leavened because they have a high sugar content. What about foods that look like grains but aren't themselves grains? Okay. Peas and beans, for example. Peas and legumes. Legumes have a different chemical content than grains. Legumes have a high nitrogen content and a low sugar content, right? That's why they're good for you, because they have protein. You can have a protein there. So are you allowed to have peas and beans on Passover? Technically, yes, because technically they're not leavened grains. They're not grains that can become leavened. However, they look like barley. They look like millet or spelt. They look like oats. And so the rabbi said, look, it's not that they are prohibited. It's that they look like stuff that's prohibited. And you're likely to make a mistake. And you're likely to eat oats thinking that you were eating peas or beans, or you'll eat a barley thinking that you were eating peas and beans. So they've prohibited those foods. That's called kitniot. They prohibited legumes on the theory that if you looked at them, you might mistake grains for those things and think you're eating, and you end up eating the wrong thing. Everybody got that so far? Which yields the following remarkable rabbinic opinion. And this is a true rabbinic opinion, and I want you to try this at your Seder table. People will be astonished that you're learning. Why is smooth peanut butter okay on Pesach, but crunchy peanut butter is not? Bum, 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 bum. The answer is because smooth peanut butter is okay because you have taken the kitniot out of their natural state and they can't be mistaken for grains. But chunky peanut butter, which still has chunks of peanuts in him, that might be mistaken for grain. Everybody see how that works? Now you're a rabbinic genius, okay? So that is the rule. Now, you can say to me, well, wait a minute. What about other things that look like grain? So there was a rabbi in the Middle Age, in early modernity, actually, in the 18th, 19th century, from Lithuania, who said we should prohibit potatoes because even though potatoes aren't grains, they're a root vegetable. You know, you could make a mistake. They do ferment, and you could make a mistake, and you could eat grains thinking that you were eating potatoes. You could eat a mashed grain thinking you were eating mashed potatoes, right? Anyone remember Rabbi Jerry Danzig, a very, very dear teacher we had at VBS, a wonderful, wonderful rabbi. This was his great-grandfather. His great-grandfather wrote a tshuva that said kartoffeln should be chametz on Pesach. And the Vilna Gaon, who was the greatest rabbi of that era, who was his teacher, wrote him a letter. And he said, are you crazy? If you take potatoes away from Eastern European Jews, they're going to starve to death, right? The funny line that he wrote was, the guy wrote a book, and the book was called Chaye Adam, which means the life of man, the life of a human being. And he wrote in the book Chaye Adam that kartoffeln, that potatoes are chametz. So the Vilna Gaon wrote him back a little limerick. He said, "You call yourself the Chaye Adam, you call yourself the life of man. That's your book. And you said kartoffeln are chametz. Well, I think kartoffeln are Chaye Adam, and you're chametz." Right? That's what he wrote. Same reason why rice. Now take 2 grains, rice and corn. Okay, rice is a grass. It grows, it grows as a grass grows, and it has all of the characteristics of grains. High sugar content, should be prohibited, but it's not one of the 7 prohibited grains of the Bible. So Ashkenazic Jews said, no, you can't eat rice either. Number one, because it behaves just like a grain. And number two, because you could make a mistake and end up eating wheat thinking it was rice. Okay. Sephardic rabbis took up that same idea, and they said the same thing that the Vilna Gaon said to the Chayei Adam. They said, look, you take rice away from Sephardic Jews, they'll starve. So for this week, rice is a vegetable. Rice is a vegetable. It has no carbohydrates. Didn't you know that? For the week of Passover, for the 8 days of Passover, rice has no carbohydrates. It has no starch in it. It's a vegetable because that's the only way that you can protect the nutritional life of Sephardic Jews. Now, corn is a really interesting one. Corn is a North American vegetable. It is a grain. It does have all the characteristics of grain. However, it's not one of the 7 ones mentioned in the Bible, but it does look like other grains and it behaves like a grain. So the rabbis have taken it out of circulation. Having said all that, rabbis in Europe over the years, especially in hard times when people didn't have access to many different kinds of food, made a heter where they said, we've taken too many foods out of circulation for Passover. So we're going to allow Jews to eat legumes as long as they're very aware of what's a legume and what's a grain. And so certain rabbis allowed the eating of legumes. When we made Aliyah to Israel, and there was a large growing Jewish population in Eretz Yisrael, right? Part of it was the Sephardim, and the Sephardim never prohibited kitniot. The Sephardim never prohibited legumes. And the Ashkenazic rabbis who had the heter, who allowed the eating of legumes, they agreed. And so Israeli Jews have eaten legumes all the time, kitniot, right? And now 2 years ago, the Rabbinical Assembly, my august union and organization, the law committee of the Rabbinical Assembly said, as long as it's allowed in Israel and it's so long as you're careful that it's not a grain, you can go ahead and eat kitniot. So legumes, according to the conservative movement, are kosher for Passover. Corn is another situation because corn is not a legume. It just looks like one. It's actually a grain. But the rabbis there said the same thing. Let's let people eat corn. So they allowed them to eat corn as well. Now, the problem with all of this is some of us have our own family customs. And while I deeply respect the Rabbinical Assembly, and far be it from me to ever be on the right of the Rabbinical Assembly, because I have never, ever in my life been more halachic than my teachers. I don't eat these things because that's not my custom. My custom is different. My custom is to not eat legumes, so I don't eat legumes on Pesach. But if you don't mind, go ahead and eat them. It's okay. Just be careful what you're eating and make sure you're not eating something you're not supposed to be eating. Yeah, Andy.
This has nothing to do with the food. This actually talks about dinner.
Okay.
First Seder is Saturday night. So the dinner for Friday night, if you're having a Friday night dinner in your house, like how does that all work? Since this only happens, 7 times a century or something like that?
It's only happened 7 times in the 20th century that we had a Friday night, Saturday kind of Pesach. Yeah. So Rabbi Galinkin, who's a dear friend of mine and a wonderful teacher of Jewish law and tradition, brilliant scholar, and a really sweet, wonderful guy, wrote a tshuva. He just published it the other day where he says, you'll appreciate this, Andy. He says, that's a great question. There are 7 answers to the question. And he lists the 7 answers with all of the footnotes. Like, I so respect this guy, and I respect the people he's working for, that they give him enough time to go look up 7 answers to a question. The answer that he comes to is the answer I would have given you because it was the answer my mother gave to me when I asked my mother. And my mother, although she was never a halachic scholar, is the one who taught me kashrus. So I know more about kosher from mom than I know about it from any teacher I ever studied with at seminary. And mom said, look, you can't eat bread. You can't eat bread. First of all, you can't find a challah anyway. And who would want to eat a challah that was baked erev Pesach? Come on. You can't eat bread because your house is already kosher lePesach, right? And you can't eat matzah because your first taste of matzah has to be at the Seder on Saturday night. So what is something you can make motzi over, which is not bread, but not matzah? And the answer is egg matzah. It's called in Hebrew matzah ashira, matzah which has been enriched. So either egg matzah, They have a matzah now, which is made with grape juice, which is actually really good, by the way. It tastes really good. Grape juice matzah, any matzah which is not official matzah, any matzah to which something besides flour and water has been added. Okay, garlic matzah, rosemary matzah. We use egg matzah. So that's the answer to the question. Use egg matzah. The funny thing is, though, so you're going to have to cook Friday night dinner, right? So I have to cook Friday night dinner like on Friday, but it means I have to have the kitchen now kosher the day earlier. And we're going to be kosher for Pesach all day Thursday and Friday, so I can cook the Seder and cook Friday night dinner and then have Shabbos. So you're going to end up with like 10 days of Pesach instead of just 8. And that, I have to tell you, is not easy for some of us. So we'll be okay. It'll be, it's not the worst thing in the world. There's plenty to eat. All right, David, you got a question, please.
Yeah, these things are very complicated. What do you think that, it's for me, it gets a little bit over the top. And what do you think the purpose is, the spiritual purpose?
All right, I appreciate the question very much. It's a really wonderful question. So let me first apologize to you and to all the Jewish people, because a lot of this sounds like inside baseball, right? I don't know how many of you are sports fans, but if you're a sports fan, you want to know like who my team is drafting in the 3rd round, and you want to know. I mean, it's inside. It's the inside game. It's a game for insiders. And for insiders, it's kind of fun. Why chunky peanut butter is not good, but it's an insider's game. And it, from an outside standpoint, you say to yourself, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. But listen, every game has its inside, right? Every human preoccupation, there are people that like to talk shop about the inside. So in sports is an area that I'm familiar with. You're into theater. You can tell me about inside game in theater and in movies, right? There's this whole thing about the Academy Awards of who was nominated and who wasn't nominated, and the politics of the Academy. And to me, I'm not interested in that, right? I'm not interested in Meghan and Harry and why they're unhappy with the royal household. But there are people who like obsess about this stuff. And so there are people who obsess about what you can eat and can't eat on Pesach. It's inside baseball. Your question, however, is so important. So let's stop and answer the question. The entire holiday of Passover that we celebrate is an expression of a line that you find in the Mishnah. The line is, B'chol dor vador chayav adam lerot et atzmo ki ilu yatsa b'Mitzrayim. In every generation, each one of us has to see him or herself as if we personally came out of Egypt. That story of our enslavement and our liberation from Egypt is the master story that forms the identity of the Jewish people. That's the master story, because out of that story, we get our sense of how the world works. We understand that there is hope because we stood on the other side of the Red Sea and we turned around and we realized Pharaoh wasn't chasing us anymore and we would be free. Our parents were slaves. Our grandparents were slaves. Their parents were slaves. We had no hope yesterday until this fellow Moses showed up and said, pack your things, we're leaving. And a few of us, not all of us, but a few of us went with him. And we crossed the Red Sea and Pharaoh wasn't chasing us. And we breathed deeply the beautiful, sweet breath of freedom. At that moment, we understood how the world works. That it is our obligation to create a society which is the opposite of Egypt, a place where human beings are valued and cherished, that it's our opportunity in the world to live as free people and to cherish the gifts of freedom and the blessings of freedom. This is the master story of Jewish identity. So every one of us has to appropriate this story in the first person. In the first person. That's what it means to identify as a Jew. Right? Look, by the way, the parallel, just so you understand, the parallel is on Thanksgiving, we tell a story about our pilgrim ancestors who came from England to Plymouth and found providential blessing in this new land. Now, my ancestors didn't come here in 1620 and land at Plymouth Rock. My ancestors were stuck in Lithuania in 1620. But to be an American is to tell that story in the first person. Every culture has a story, which is its master story, and this is our master story. So now the question is, if that's what I have to do, is to tell that story in the first person, how am I going to do that? Well, what I'm going to do is to create a historical drama, a play. It's all a play. The Seder is a play. The table is the stage. The Haggadah is the script. The food on the table are the props. And we're going to pretend we're in Egypt for the last night. The Seder is the last night in Egypt. And for that whole week, we're going to eat what they ate. They ate a flat bread because they didn't have time to let it rise. And every time we eat, there's a contrast there. It's a beautiful irony. It's tasteless, it's flat, it's dry, it's not terribly good. And yet, to us, it's the sweetest bread you could possibly have given us because it's the bread of our freedom. It's the bread of our liberation. And so that's what the whole thing is about. You create a change in people's living pattern in order to reinforce the idea that we were slaves and now we're free. We were slaves and now we're free. And that's what the whole holiday is about. And all of the rituals of the holiday, this arcane eating pattern, what you can eat, what you can't eat, cleaning the kitchen, having the Seder, all this stuff is about telling that story and feeling that story and literally ingesting the story. We eat what they ate. We ingest our own history. And that's how this works. So that's the answer to the question. Okay? Thank you. Other questions? This is your last chance to ask questions. Yes, Phyllis, please. You have to unmute, please. There you go.
About doing the search for hummus. That has to be on Thursday, right?
Yeah, Thursday night. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things what you're asked to do by the Torah is not only avoid eating hummus, but you have to get it out of your house. You have to literally sweep it out of your house. Now, that was easy in the old days when you had a 2-room hovel, and all your food was kept in a burlap bag. A little harder when you live in an Encino mansion with a giant pantry. So what you do is you clean out, we clean our kitchen. We put all the hummus stick stuff away. We put the toaster in the other room. And then you do 3 things which recognize that the hummus is out of my house. Thing number 1 is I sign a contract which is a theoretical sale of all of my hummus to a non-Jewish person. And so you do this, I do this you can sign it online at the VBS website, or if you want to go into the synagogue, they do it there. And so all my hummus for the week is sold to the maintenance supervisor at Valley Beth Shalom. My friend Rick becomes the master of hummus in the San Fernando Valley. And so technically it's not my hummus. If it's not my hummus, it's not my responsibility. That's number 1. Number 2 is I burn some hummus. So on Friday morning, I'm going to burn something, and I'm going to say an incantation, basically, which says, if there's hummus left in my house, it's not mine. I don't want it. It's just like schmutz. Literally, that's the word, and it's a ka'ever va'ara. It's like dust of the earth. It's just schmutz. It's not my hummus. We put it away, and then on Thursday night, you do a little search and destroy mission. When I was a kid, we used to have it was a big game because I have 3 younger brothers. We would take little Cheerios, little piles of Cheerios, and we put 12 of them around the house. We'd only find 10. So you go around with a candle and a feather, although we use a flashlight now and a vacuum cleaner, which is much better. And you go around with those shark vacuum cleaners and a flashlight looking for the hummus, and you go looking for the hummus. It's the sort of last step, but it's a wonderful game for kids to play. Now, the Hasidic tradition had a beautiful interpretation of that. They said, it's not that you're looking for crumbs under the sofa cushions or, dried up although there is a lot of junk in my house, What you're really doing is it's the opposite. It's the counterpart to what you did 6 months ago. When Yom Kippur came, we did a search for all that was rotten and sour and crummy inside of ourselves. And now we do it outside. But it really is reflective of an inside. Hummus is that which has soured, that which has fermented, that which has in some ways rotted. And we have to do that inside. So you go look for all the resentments, all the insults, all of the angers, all of that kind of stuff that's in our souls, and we wash it out, we clean it out. So we can start Pesach as free people. People who are bound by their bitterness, bound by their anger, their resentments, their contempt, their need for revenge, their need to get even. That's not a free way. That's not a way to be free. You have to clean all that stuff out so you can start fresh. And that's really what Pesach is offering us the chance to do. But it's a great game if you have little kids. You hide a few pieces of hummus around and you go looking for it, and it's a lot of fun. And then you have a big celebration as you get rid of it. Okay? But you do that Thursday night. Friday morning, you burn your hummus. Make sure you sell it. The siyum, by the way, there's a custom that we who are firstborn, and I am a firstborn, we who are firstborn, we fast the day before Pesach. Okay? So this year, that's Thursday morning. So we'll have a siyum Thursday morning. There's a celebration of the firstborn on Thursday morning at Minyan at 7:30 online. Okay? Great questions. Wonderful questions. Any other pressing, interesting? Yeah, Douglas, go ahead. Don't you sure.
Okay. You cannot spin this tale without saying that God is an active player in history.
Right.
And as a modern, the Haggadah is all about what God did, and as a modern, you have to sit there and say, what the role of God in history, the best I can do is say it's a tale to get my kids interested, but it's a tale.
Okay.
How do you make consistent the story of the Haggadah and the role of God in history with being a modern?
That's a great question. That's a really very, very interesting question. So I would ask the question in a different way. We have come to believe that there are rules to the physical universe. Gravity, okay? We have is a rule of the physical universe, and gravity is a rule that applies in all places and all times, and you violate it at your peril. Okay, are there moral rules? Is there a moral order? Are there moral rules to the universe, such that certain behaviors, policies, practices bring certain consequences? Are there moral rules? Okay, is there a moral rule to the universe, right? So if you read the speeches of Martin Luther King, right, or Nelson Mandela, these were people who believed that there was a moral order. Right? When Martin Luther King, it wasn't his quotation, it wasn't his line, it was actually, he was quoting it from a preacher who said that the arc of justice bends, but slowly, but it bends. It bends toward, the arc of history bends toward justice. Okay. So he believed that a people cannot be enslaved forever. At some point, they're going to rise up, and they're going to demand their freedom. If you just read the "I Have a Dream" speech, right? Read Nelson Mandela's stuff. Read letters from a Birmingham jail. These are people who believe that there was a moral order. It'd be really interesting if you're going to be with your kids, ask them: Is there a moral order? Behaviors in personal life, we understand that behaviors carry consequences. Is that true for the world at large? Is that true for a society? Can a society practice cruelty and get away with it? Or is there an accounting for its cruelty at some point in history? And what's the nature of that accounting? Okay? I think that's such an interesting question. Right, we're in the middle of such an interesting moment of our history, besides COVID, which is itself a very interesting question. Can a country like the United States of America truly isolate itself from the rest of the world and pursue its own interests? Or is that a formula for disaster worldwide? Okay, can a country like the United States of America subjugate a class of its citizens, or allow a class of its citizens, put it this way so I'm not so political, allow a class of its citizens to feel themselves subjugated without addressing and redressing that sense of subjugation? Or does that inherently destabilize the society? Okay, I mean, these are really interesting questions that are very pertinent questions right now. Okay, here's another question that you can ask. So the question is, so the real question is there a moral order? leave the word God out. It's too complicated. It's too difficult. It's too fraught with emotion. Ask this question: are there rules to history? Can a society practice injustice forever, or does it come back to haunt them at some point? That's the question. Try that, Douglas. Does that work for you?
I suppose, but I would say that it's a harder question for like China or North Korea than it is for the United States, because China's still practicing genocide with the what's it, Uyghurs or something, how they pronounce that? Uyghurs.
Right.
And North Korea, the next time their people see freedom will be the first time.
Right. Okay. And there's a gentleman in Minneapolis who's on trial now for murder and 3 other charges because he leaned on a black man's neck for 8.5 minutes and killed him. Yeah. And the question is, if that man is acquitted, what will that do to America? What will that say about America? Can you have a population of people of color in this country? Again, whether you believe them or not, they believe that they are subjugated. And the question is, how do you redress that? When do you redress that? And if you don't redress it, what are the consequences?
I have an African-American legal assistant. I asked her if she could vote for an acquittal on that police officer if the state failed to make its case. She said, no problem. I said, problem. I don't know that I could do that.
Yeah.
And that's a lawyer in me, and I'd be scared to death to be on that jury.
Okay.
Because I don't know that I'd want to vote for an acquittal for what could possibly happen to me, even if, the state failed to prove its case.
But the idea that African-American people are terrified to be pulled over for a traffic violation because they're terribly afraid they're going to be the subjects of violence. There's a huge split in the experience of citizenship between white folks and black folks. And whether how long can you tolerate that? How long can you put up with that kind of injustice? Or I'm not even sure it's the injustice. I think there is injustice. I think we can demonstrate that, but I don't want to make this a political argument. The perception of injustice, you see? So the question really is, are there rules to history? Are there rules to me, that's the question. Yeah, Stanley, go ahead.
I was going to say that I think Douglas's question is a more general question about studying Torah at all, or studying Judaism from a Torah perspective. We have to know that even though it's not literal, it's not factual, let's say, everything that we read, that there's truth there and lessons to be learned. And I think that's the same thing that we can say about the Seder. We can't say that everything that is in the Seder is more than a story, but we can say that it gives value to our lives and there's lessons to be learned, and that it enhances us as a society and as Jews to do it.
So the question Douglas is asking is a very important question. Jews always believed, up until modernity, Jews always believed that there was a God in the world, and that God was the master of history, and that God actually, and for most Jews, that God was the agent of history, and we were just bystanders. We were just waiting for God to redeem us, and that the things that happened to us in history were God's will. Temple was destroyed because God willed it. Right? We were exiled from our land because God willed it. We will be redeemed one day because God will it. I mean, this is and this is what's written into the Haggadah as a religious document. Okay, comes along modernity, and we look at history with very different eyes. Modernity teaches us to look at history through a secular lens, that there are social and economic and political reasons for things to happen. And it's not God's will. This is stuff that happened. Why was the temple destroyed? Because the Romans had a policy of expansion, of colonial expansion. I mean, so it changes your perspective. That's number one. Then comes the Holocaust. And the Holocaust completely destroys our notion that there's a God who's governing history. Because if you believe in that, then you somehow have to imagine that this was divine will. And none of us can imagine it. As Richard Rubinstein, a philosopher, once wrote, it's too obscene a thought to think that Hitler was doing God's will. So we've put away that idea of God in history, and we think about it in different terms. But I still want to raise the question about whether there are certain rules to history. Can a society perpetuate injustice on a group of people and not pay a price at some point? Was apartheid destined to fall? Was slavery in America destined to fall? Because there is a moral order to the universe, even though it works a lot slower than gravity, is still there. Sandy, please.
I was just going to say, maybe it's time to relook at the Haggadah, to change. I know I was on a Zoom with a multicultural Haggadah that was the other night from HAU.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to make it, if we're to redo the Haggadah, but not quite so political. I want to be able to sit down with a family with different ideas and not. But because what you're saying is absolutely correct. I mean, to me, it absolutely fits with what I believe. But I'd like something that you can handle with a group of different beliefs.
So there is a site. There's a website called Haggadot.com, and it's Haggadot.com. You'll find there dozens of them. They've done a wonderful collection. They're all online. You can borrow from them. You take one and use it as a template, and you can bring poetry and readings and pictures from all the other ones. There's video Haggadahs. There's so many options now that do exactly what you're looking for. They ask us to imagine what is the core truth of this ritual, but how can we express that truth in terms that are more apropos for us? The traditional Haggadah is very opaque. It really is hard to get through. I wrote a Haggadah with Rabbi Schulweiss years ago, and you can read our Haggadah. It's on there too, but you can read it on the VBS website, because I wanted to try to make it a little bit more accessible to people. I mean, I grew up on the Maxwell House Haggadah, which is, good to the last trope, but which is of course the one God gave us. But otherwise, there's so many good ones, and I think that the question. If you're doing a Seder with people of different backgrounds and different views and different ages, turn it into an evening of questions. I mean, make kiddush and light candles and eat some matzah, but ask some of these kinds of questions. I think it's wonderful. I think that, please.
Name the site one more time.
I just put it on the chat. It's called Haggadot.com. Yeah. Bert.
The question about is there a moral order to the universe? As I think about things that have happened over time, what happened in Africa, what happened in ancient times, there always seems to be an end to a particular historical setting. And I think the question is, why did that happen? Was it because of a moral order, or was it the free will of another group of people who wanted to change where they were? And I can argue both ways, but all the examples, apartheid, et cetera, they all end the same way. Something crashes. British Empire crashed from what it was at one time. So I don't know if it's a natural thing or if it's free will, man-made, because of their own want to change.
That's the question. That's a wonderful question to discuss at your Seder table. Look, most of us go to dinner at night and we talk about the news or sports or relations, who's with who and what's going on, or this one's mad at this. You imagine having a meal where you get to discuss, is there a moral order to human history? What a great question to even get to ask. So I respect that. That's the question. That's a brilliant question. And ask people to bring some thoughts about that. Yeah, go ahead.
My brother-in-law and sister-in-law came over for dinner last night, which was an event in itself. Okay, everybody had shots. And we talked, believe it or not, I talked about Job. Because of what we have done the last, 4, 5, 6 weeks, something like that. And that was a different class of conversation, but we all agree it was an interesting way to dialogue. rather than how's your car mileage, or
Yes.
just the movies.
Yeah.
So I hear you.
Good. All right. We're going to have to wrap up in just a moment. David, you get the last question.
Well, the whole conversation going back to the Haggadah and God and the simplistic story, to me begs the question about the issue of belief in God. I mean, why is God even mentioned in the Bible? Why are all these stories talking about God? Now, I have my own feelings about that, but the issue of belief in God, and is there something, some participation in our lives of something beyond which we can understand. So I think it's a very interesting thing to
It's a brilliant question. It's a wonderful question. And the question is it supernatural or natural? Is it work through us or around us or with us? These are the kinds of questions, and and I really think this is the kind of thing that a Seder table conversation, if you're able to do it with adults, really ends up being really, really interesting. Are there consequences to policy decisions? Does the country, did America pay a price for Vietnam? Did America pay a price for slavery, for racism? Do societies pay a price for the evil they perpetrate? Right? You don't get frogs falling from heaven. My knowledge, that's not happened in Washington, D.C. But you do have things that happen to a society when it perpetuates certain kinds of cruelties and immoralities. And I wonder whether we can put our fingers on those and say, well, that's the way the world works. That's the reality that the Haggadah story is pointing to. That would be the question that I would want to pose to my family at the table. I'm going to pose to my family at the Seder table. Well, folks, we didn't get a chance to open the book today, but we did have a great discussion. So thank you for your time. Just to give a scheduling update. So we will meet next week, which is the 24th. We'll have lunch and learn at 12:30, like always. And then we are going to take off the 31st. It's Chol HaMoed Pesach, and I'm going to go away with my wife, whether she likes it or not, and spend a little bit of downtime together. And we will return so next week we're on, the 31st we're off, we'll return on the 7th, okay? Let me wish all of you a very good Shabbos. We'll see you this week. Take good care. Be well.